Hi everyone, my name is Lizzie and I'm the moderator for today's event. Welcome to our first national forum for signatories and supporters of the Australian Engineering Declaration of Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. We're expecting over 100 participants today and it may take a couple of minutes for everyone to join us. So in the interim, what I'd like to do is run through some housekeeping regarding the format of today's forum and how you can participate with us. So today we're using the Zoom webinar platform. I imagine many of you are already quite familiar with it. It does mean that you can't unmute yourself or see each other's videos. What you can do though is post questions through the Q&A feed as soon as the panel discussion starts very shortly. Due to the number of registrations today, we made the decision to in fact pre-record the first part of the panel discussion. So what we're going to do is run that for about 25 minutes and then we'll go live for the Q&A session. And we encourage you to start posting questions through the Q&A feed from the outset. We'd also like to invite you to participate in a live collaboration process during the panel discussion using a digital platform called Mural. So in your email yesterday, you will have received a link through to Mural. If you're interested, you can click on that. You don't need to register, and then you can actually interact with one another through a series of different workspaces. So this is an opportunity for you to add ideas, comments and resources, thoughts and questions throughout the course of today's discussion. Just so you're aware, session notes and a recording will be made available in the coming week. And if you do have any technical issues or questions, my colleague Jackie Bell is helping out and she's keeping an eye on the info@engineersdeclared.org.au account. Similarly, as we go through this afternoon session, we'd love to invite you to share your insights with others online, and the hashtag is provided there on the screen as well. So before we go much further, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, on behalf of us all. I'm joining you today from Brisbane, where I'm on the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. Look, I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that our world has absolutely fundamentally changed in the past 2 months with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's posed an unprecedented threat to the health of our families, our community here in Australia, and of course the global community as well. Our values are being challenged, our physical contact is dramatically restricted, and for many people, unfortunately, job continuity is also under threat. Suddenly, we care much more about our contact with others, our access to the environment, the quality of our homes and the buildings in which we're working. And really, we're actually starting to have to form a new mindset and a new set of behaviours. And interestingly, the rapid changes that we've implemented since February, March are inadvertently moving us towards a low carbon and perhaps a more equitable and caring world as well. So today we're actually going to discuss what this means for the engineering profession. So for our newcomers, my name is Lizzie Webb and I'm the moderator for today's event. I'm an environmental engineer by background and I'm a member of the rapidly growing team of people who are working together to build a movement around the Engineering Declaration of Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. Some of us might have actually connected previously through my former work with Engineers Without Borders. These days, my primary work is with a group called Kindred Spirits Enterprises, where I work with First Nations entrepreneurs. So today is our first online national forum for signatories and supporters of the movement. And our plan is actually to hold regular events like this one to build a really strong and connected community around the declaration and to showcase leading thinking and practice regarding climate and sustainability action. But most importantly, we want to support collaboration and accelerate and amplify the transition towards a more equitable and sustainable world. So today we're going to have a conversation about the mindset shift, the leadership and the actions that we need to take together to move towards a low carbon, regenerative and equitable future. I'm going to invite our panel to share their experiences implementing new practices within the engineering profession. And we're going to respond to the question, so what will brave engineering look like in the post-COVID-19 world? So we're going to flip now to the pre-recording and I encourage you to start putting your questions through the Q&A feed. But care. Robert is a Professor of Practice at UNSW in Sydney and a Director of Red R Australia. Robert, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Robert. We also have Dr. Amanda Carl, Founder and CEO of The Next Economy. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks for having me, Lizzie.
We have Chris Bunting, who's an experienced sustainability consultant and sustainability manager with Northrop Consulting Engineers. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Liz. Looking forward to it.
And we also have with us Jane Hadgen, a Director of Contexus, engineer and corporate ecologist. Hello, Jane.
Nice to be here.
Excellent. So the four of you are all signatories to the Australian Engineers Declaration of Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. And each of you over the last 3-4 months have directly supported the movement all the way from back in September last year. I'd love to start by asking each of you in turn, what motivated you to become a signatory of the movement? And Robert, we might start with you. The reason being you were actually one of the first people that we contacted and signed an open letter that went to the profession in September last year, calling on engineers and their organisations to join up.
As an engineer who's been practicing for 40 years, it occurred to me that whilst we hadn't appreciated the significance of what we're facing through all those years, we're very well aware of what we're facing. And to me, it was a time to take a stand and to stand for something that was consistent with our code of ethics, to actually think about future generations as well as current generations. And to me, Engineers Declare spoke to that. And that's the reason I threw my weight behind it.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert. And what about you, Jane? What encouraged you or motivated you to sign up?
I think for me, it's really about having a clear intentionality about what I want to see and where I want to put my efforts. So the way the declaration is framed and the declaration points are very succinct, a very succinct way of describing what I believe we should all be working towards. I agree with Robert that it seems like now is the time to act. You know, there's language around about the decade of action, and this is our opportunity. So I'm very excited about what the profession can achieve.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jane. Now, Chris, Jane's just made a reference there to the 12 commitments that underpin the declaration, and you've actually spoken on many occasions now at events about those specific commitments. So what motivated you to get involved?
Look, I think for me, it was the school strike for climate. I attended a number of the marches last year, and at one of them I actually went along and interviewed on camera a number of the students, and they spoke so passionately and eloquently about the issues, and they were there with their parents. There were university students who were studying biodiversity that I interviewed. There was such a deep level of understanding of the sense of urgency, the need for change, and also a very clear idea of what the solutions should be. And reflecting on that, I felt that you know, the profession that I was part of, engineering organisations, didn't feel that same sense of urgency, and actually viewed the people on the street, the activists, with perhaps some level of suspicion. But these were people from our communities. These were our friends, our neighbours. Some of these were our own kids. And so there was kind of a disconnect there that I felt it was really time that we really stepped up our game, because we had a level of responsibility and accountability to those communities and to our own families to do a whole lot more.
Chris, you've touched on multiple points I'd like to pursue further, but we'll just hold on a moment. You've just mentioned, Chris, the disconnect between the engineering profession and its work and what we're seeing happening broadly in society and school students and their parents marching. Amanda, you've actually been working for many, many years now to bridge that disconnect in different ways, most recently through founding The Next Economy. So tell us a bit about your background, and as a non-engineer, albeit a big supporter of the profession, what's connected you with the movement?
Yeah, I guess I've been in and around the climate movement for about 10 years, nearly 10 years now. And I actually started working with engineers through, after I left Engineers Without Borders, working with Beyond Zero Emissions. And that was really inspiring, that actually engaging people with technical expertise to come up with a plan. And then that didn't sort of go anywhere. So for the last 6 years, I've been working more on the front lines with communities, government and industry to kind of, I guess, get them to that place of understanding that we need to change. And just in the last 12 months, I've seen that shift. Like, people know that they need to change now, but they don't know where their place is in that change process. So we can have plans, we have all the technological solutions that we need, but how do we actually engage people in different professions? And engineers, we need engineers to do this. And they have the problem solving skills. They're building the world that we need. So I think this is just so great as an initiative.
Thanks, Amanda. And you've just made reference. I'd love to explore for a moment, what do we mean by, can you perhaps tell us a little bit about where you feel we're getting to when we talk about transition to a more sustainable society? Chris, I might put that question to you first, if I may.
Well, I think, we need to see a transition that's commensurate with the that we face. And so if we're talking about a climate emergency, that's pretty immediate. It's time bound. It can't just be, we're going to get a little bit better. It means that we actually have to have very specific goals, and we need to bring as many people along on the journey, industries, organisations, individuals, governments, communities, as quickly as possible. And we need to bring to the table a vision of a better future. I think that inspires and engages people. And so I think what's been great about the Engineers Declare movement is creating space to have the conversation about what is that vision? What does that future look like?
And thanks, Chris. And Robert, what does that vision or that future look like to you?
Well, I think it is a vision of a future that actually represents a sustainable future for the world, for the people in the world. Actually, I mean, the world will be fine, but the humans that occupy the world might not be fine unless we get this right. And it's interesting at the time that we're having this conversation, at a time when we are actually facing another emergency with COVID-19. And I think that's demonstrated amply to us the components of an emergency, and how we actually need to transition from one state to another state. In this case, very quickly. Climate change is taking place more slowly, but I think it's important that we make sure that we've got that sense of community that can actually take us to, a better place than we would otherwise be unless we act.
Thanks very much, Robert. Jane, what's your perspective?
One of the key words for me here is healing. So if every action that we took in professionally and in our personal lives was healing both the planet we live on and the communities we live in, then we would go a long way to solving some of these challenges. So I think COVID, Robert brought up the COVID situation, and I think that's a good example of where there's a huge range of businesses actively shifting their models or shifting the way they work or the contribution they make to actively contribute to the most vulnerable parts of our society. And I think one of the most amazing things that's come out of this whole situation is watching that happen very, very rapidly. To me, it's just evidence that we can. And we need to take the same action on a much larger and much deeper scale to address some of our societal challenges, but also the environmental challenges that come along with climate change.
Amanda, I've noticed that you're nodding there, and obviously you and I both work together through the Next Economy as well, and something that I know is absolutely fundamental to your practice is the notion or the principle of a just transition, that we bring everyone along with us, because this is ultimately about quality of life, not just for ourselves and our families, but for all society. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and this is what often gets lost when we're talking about very specific things like climate change, but in the current disruption, I'm not just talking about COVID-19, we've got a whole lot of challenges that we're facing, whether it's, depletion of soils, growing potential for food crises around the world. these disruptions give us an opportunity to kind of look at what's important. Say, how do we build the systems and processes that are centred on the concept of well-being? So what does it mean if we're actually living within planetary boundaries? So we're not just reducing and absorbing emissions for the climate, but actually looking at all our food, our land and water and other systems as well, natural systems. But how do we do it in a way that we're actually generating the opportunity for well-being for everyone? There's actually enough for everybody. It's actually our systems that we've set up that have actually set up this inequality that we see in the world. So what would it look like if everyone had a chance not just to survive, but thrive?
Actually pick up a little bit on that, Amanda. I think it's amazing to see how nature and living systems are starting to thrive during this time of COVID-19, that rivers are getting cleaner, wildlife is coming back into cities, air quality is getting healthier. So there's this potential there that just wants to burst forth, and even communities that perhaps getting stronger and families are developing. So that tendency is always there. It's just that we are overwhelming the capacity of life to respond in that way under typical circumstances. It just can't push through. But we see that it's there, and I think I'm excited about the idea of regenerative potential. And that is really understanding, how do we recognise that potential for life to thrive, which is always there in different ways, in different places. But how can we come together and actually consider how, as engineers, we can contribute to that thriving, and what we do, our sphere of influence, can actually unlock that potential, and we can help make the world a better place.
And Chris, I can't think of a more inspiring purpose or mandate for the profession either, really. And at its heart, I suspect that that's actually why most individuals become engineers in the first place. It's just that perhaps once we get well and truly entrenched in the current way of working, that we lose sight of that a little bit.
Part of that is linked to the speed at which this transition needs to occur. And there's no doubt that, in my mind, there's no doubt that in X years, 5 years, 10 years, maybe 2 years, we will stop burning coal to generate electricity. What we have to do is deal with those communities whose life and livelihood depends on the digging out and the burning of coal, and help them transition. The longer we leave that to actually deal with it, the harder that will become, the more rapid the transition will occur, and that's when people will get left behind. We actually have to work really hard at actually dealing with that now. And I think the COVID-19 thing, and yes, all the other crises that are going on, but the COVID-19 has demonstrated that people will get left behind when you actually have to deal with things very rapidly, and you lose your way. And you can see examples all through the world at the moment of people being left behind because of the crisis we're in. That to me says we've got to act, and we've got to act now.
That's a really interesting thing, because that's often the debate, is if we have to move quickly, can we afford to do all of that? But if you look at the countries that are dealing better with the COVID-19 crisis, they're countries like Australia that actually have had education and health systems and other systems in place where the society has been functioning generally better than a lot of other places. And we're dealing with it better. There's still issues. The issues are the cracks in the system where we haven't actually been bringing everyone along generally. It's looking at who's excluded from the existing system that are dealing with it the toughest. So the question is, how do we use the work that we need to do around transition, the renewable energy that we need to build, the way we need to reduce and absorb emissions across all sectors, not just energy? How do we do that to address Indigenous rights and issues? Like, can we have community-owned renewable energy systems in Aboriginal communities that actually create jobs, where communities own their own energy, they're reducing the energy prices, where we could improve housing? These are the sort of questions. It's like, let's look at the cracks as opportunities to actually build a better society.
And I think one of the things we're seeing happen is, our values are shifting a little bit during COVID-19. So we're valuing some of the professions differently: teachers, cleaners, healthcare workers. We're looking at different metrics to measure the health of our society. We're not so interested in GDP. We're interested in maybe are we winning the war against the COVID-19? How many people are recovering from disease? Are we able to provide the funding for people who are losing their jobs? Small businesses, what can we do to support them? It's really helping us maybe shift our value set a little bit, which is in line with where we need to go. If we need to start caring more about that just transition and vulnerable people and groups, I think we're certainly heading in that direction.
Chris, I think you've raised an absolutely critical point here, that unless we actually reflect quite deeply on our values and then think differently about how we bring value through our work as engineers, we're not fundamentally going to see the change that we actually really, really need. Jane, I'm interested in your perspective on the sort of paradigm that we really need to be working within to see the change required.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'd say that we need to shift our values so much. I agree with the comment, your Chris comment about shifting what we measure. I 100% agree with that. I actually think most people hold the values that they require to undertake this transition. I think you used the word, Chris, before about a disconnect, and I certainly see that in the leaders that I work with. So, you know, I can give you an example of a significant sized business in Australia, ASX listed, and whose children marched in the climate marches, and the business that this individual runs is, we would put it in the businesses that probably need to shift a good portion of their business model. Not probably, they do need to. They're a significant emitter of carbon. There's not a short-term plan to address that. Yeah, that we would definitely be pointing the finger at them. But he hadn't connected the activism of his 20-something-year-old daughters to his work. And for me, that's the problem. That is the crux of the problem. He's having that conversation around the dinner table at home, and he is not bringing the sense of urgency that his own family is communicating with him, and what is important from a values point of view. He's clearly taught those values. How do children get values? They get them from their parents, right? He's clearly taught those values to his kids, and yet he's not bringing that into the workplace. And that's essentially what, you know, our work is about. That is about building that connection.
And I think, Jane, that's probably a very common situation. Robert, you've worked in the engineering profession for many, many years. Can you shed some light on that disconnect? Do you think there is a disconnect? And if so, why is that happening?
Yeah, look, I think it is a disconnect because people compartmentalise this in different areas, and it's also a matter of what you're used to, what you're comfortable in working with. I think as engineers we are trained to reduce things down to what we can actually handle, and it was touched on earlier, the whole question of systems thinking about this, because everything interacts with everything else, and indeed COVID-19 interacts with what we're doing here. We can see that in terms of the impact of the isolation, the shutting down of systems that has actually brought that forward. And it's partly what, you know, talk about values. One of my values is, having spent that time that you referred to working as an engineer, that one of my purpose in life these days is to find those people who will be the catalyst for change that the world needs. And that's part of, again, one of the reasons why I have committed to Engineers Declare, because I think that's actually a very important group of people that will be the catalyst that will make those linkages to the values that are important, and the impact of those values on how we live our lives and how we actually conduct ourselves. So I think it's very much linking to the values that we hold, and making sure those come to the fore rather than get hidden in the day-to-day business of solving today's problems. Yeah.
Now, Chris, you're working as a senior sustainability consultant with clients every day. How do your personal values manifest in those discussions?
Well, look, I guess for myself, I feel like my role is to help bring about the change that we've been talking about, and But to do that within my own sphere of influence, you have to be realistic about what you can do, and also bring a lot of humility to the table. You know, I might be a sustainability professional, but I only have a portion of the answers, and everybody that I work with has the other part of the answers and the knowledge and the solution. So we have to actually collaborate, and that's difficult, I think, in an age where we're moving very fast. There's a lot of time pressure, financial pressure, pressure to perform. But actually, what we need to do is sit back, try and work out what are the right questions to ask, such as, you know, how can this particular project contribute to making the world a better place? That isn't a question that's normally asked. It's, in fact, if I asked it at most design team meetings, or the first one that I went to, I would probably get looks of disdain. That's not a relevant question. We just need to build this thing and get on with it. But I think we need to spend a bit more time in those questions, collaborating, having other stakeholders in the room. We usually don't have anybody in a typical design meeting. We wouldn't have anybody that represents nature, so to speak. Nature does not have a voice, and we can all try and give nature a voice, but most of us struggle to have a full understanding of how nature works, and this is one of the big challenges. So trying to create the space to have those conversations, to slow things down a little bit, so that we can put our emphasis in the right places and make sure that what we're doing is not just perhaps creating a more sustainable building or project, but we're actually transforming the people in the room, our organisations, community.
Oh, crazy, Chris.
And have that transformation happen.
That's just brilliant. It's interesting that your reflections, Chris, because I guess my job's a bit different. I bring different stakeholders together. So there will be engineers in the room, but there'll also be government people and business people, and sometimes environment and union groups. And going back to what Robert said, I work a lot in coal communities or areas where they are producing electricity through coal. And what's astounding to me is these communities that we think are most resistant are where I hear the most radical questions. They don't know that they're radical questions, but they are asking about, what is the future of our community if we keep going? We can see the writing on the wall. Why aren't we investing in something different? What are the answers? How do we actually create good jobs? We don't just want jobs, we want actual good jobs for our children into the future. We want to, and this is before COVID, but people in Central Queensland earlier this year were saying, we're actually not as resilient as we used to be. How do we make sure that we're self-sufficient with whatever comes our way? So there's definitely openings. People want to, but they just don't know where to start with that conversation and what the next steps are.
Yeah. It's not just about jobs. I mean, I think we have this mantra, it's about jobs, it's about jobs. I think it's about careers, it's about having a purpose in life and actually doing something that's meaningful, not just, in quotes, a job. I mean, we can all have a job to get by from time to time, but, really having a meaningful career in terms of what you do is to me much more fulfilling.
I think that's part of, certainly from my, I practiced in the aerospace industry as an engineer, and we used to talk a lot about the disconnect between the thing that we did every day and the end product, or in this case, I would say even the outcome. And I think for an engineer sitting behind a desk, crunching numbers on a reductionist problem, Robert, to your point, to solve today's piece of the puzzle that contributes to XYZ report, the connection to the output, let alone the outcome for the planet and the community, is today potentially a big stretch. And I think I certainly have a level of consciousness when I'm working on Engineers Declare or other work that we are asking people to engage in a different type of mindset, and it's a uncomfortable mindset because as engineers, unless the training's changed significantly, we're taught that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and that there's a right way to get to that answer and a wrong way to get to that answer, and that's not the case with these problems.
Jane, I agree very strongly, and Chris, I'd just love to come back to your point. It sounds like something all of us could do from this afternoon is create more space within our work teams and with our peers and colleagues in other organisations as well, to talk about the purpose of the project that we're working on and what that ultimate outcome and vision is. And then perhaps from there, actually say, well, and what would metrics of success like that are beyond the financial or you know, the profit for the client? That in itself, even if it doesn't immediately change the nature of the design or the operation of a project, start shifting what people are talking about, and therefore, you know, there'll be a flow-on effect down at some point into decision making as well, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that many organisations are you know, dealing with in a very competitive environment is how do they attract and retain high-performing people? And there's been some really good studies out there showing that young people, young engineers, actually value having a meaningful job, particularly one that contributes to positive social and environmental outcomes, as a very big priority for them. Yes, they want good work. They want to work for a good company. They want to be, you know, paid, you know, fairly. But if they can also get a meaningful job as part of that, then that's a real winner for them, and it helps organisations attract those people, keep them engaged. And you know, for me, it's about organisations really fostering what you might call a benefit mindset. People talk about the growth mindset, but the benefit mindset is more about, you know, how can I not just be the best in the world, but how can I be the best for the world? And it's really inspiring, I think, for young people.
Well, hello everyone. We're now streaming live with members of our advisory group who form our panel today. Thanks very much for your patience if you had a few issues there with the audio visual. The funny thing is, we thought that by pre-recording it was actually going to minimise technical challenges. So all of the panel, you've probably noticed, have been sitting here patiently on the side. So I think next time around we might just do it live from the outset, huh? Anyway, we've now got an opportunity for you to pose your questions to the panel, and there's some great ones that are coming through already. But I'd love to kick off by saying, look, we've talked about the urgent need for change in our behaviour and our practice, and it doesn't matter if we're the, you know, graduate engineer or the chair of a board, and that's going to be tough. We're going to have to stand up for what we believe in and make some pretty hard decisions as well. So I'd like to kick off by asking our panel, what does it mean to be brave in the engineering profession in this new world context? And Robert, if you don't mind my putting you on the spot, I might move to you first, if I may.
Thanks, Lizzie. Look, I think to think about being brave or courageous is linked to what we try to tackle here. I think we know the challenges, we can see the challenges, and we know a lot of the answers, if not all the answers. We know most of them, and we need to proceed on that. I think we will need to act differently than we've acted in the past. You know, that's the nature of disruption. But the important thing here is you're not alone, and I think that's one of the powerful things of the movement, is that it'll actually bring people together. I'm fond of saying we need to find each other in this world that we're in to actually help each other. And to me, there are people out there who can help you, who are probably thinking the same thing you are. They may not have found the bravery to say it yet, but find the bravery. And courage is not about, you know, coming up with the right answers. Courage and bravery is about knowing the difficulties that you'll face and doing it anyway. And so I encourage you to do that. But go and find people that think similarly to you. And I know one of the questions that's coming up about, you know, how do you do this if you're working for an employer that doesn't get it? Well, the answer is go and find one that does.
Thanks, Robert. And I recall from one of our previous discussions, you talked about the idea that when a tough situation comes up, making a very conscious decision about doing something that might be hard. And that really resonated with me because, you know, the change in behaviour, whether we're talking about at an individual level or within a whole engineering team, won't happen inadvertently, I don't think. So Amanda, I might pass to you now because your experience is both within the engineering profession and well beyond it, with many, many years experience mobilising communities around change. What does it mean to be brave?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, or brave or courage. Like when I first started working back in Australia about 7 years ago, I was actually stunned by the lack of bravery in Australia. I mean, it was interesting. I was talking to heads of government and industry who were actually saying to me back in 2014, so 6 years ago, we know that we need to transition. We know we need to do something about climate change, but we just don't think everyone's ready for it yet. We're just going to hold off. And I was just like, this is crazy. In a country where we have so many resources, technical expertise, we know what we need to do. We've got smart people and the skills to do it and the infrastructure to do it. What's holding everyone back compared to other countries I've worked in? But I think now is really interesting because just in the last 12 months, but even more now with COVID, something has shifted. So those people who were hesitant to change because they didn't think they had enough support or reason to do it, I think they're starting to realise that they've got a lot more to lose if they don't act now, and they've got a lot more to gain if they do. So I think that is a key, is that balance of actually, but we've got to show them that they have support. They need to hear, our leaders, whether they're business, in your own business or government, they need to hear that we want something different. So, and the people who are brave enough to stand up, they're connected. So what Robert was saying, you find the other people who support you, which gives you that confidence to speak up. But also I think something we often shy away from is talking about is we've got to build our own political skills and learn how to speak up and learn how to connect with other people and learn how to navigate the system that we're in as well, which I think the environment movement is very good at. But I think in professions, we just don't know where to start. And we think if we just tell the truth, then something should happen. But I think we could do more on our social and political skills, which might be a bit scary to a lot of engineers.
Oh, well, perhaps a little unfamiliar, but I think a number of our advisory group members have already touched on that point, that we all need to find where our points of influence are, and that requires quite a conscious thought process and reflection. And again, it doesn't matter what career stage we're up to; we've all got those points of influence. It just looks a bit different depending on our context. Cool. Well, I'm going to go to the first of the questions that came through now from Lee, who's asked, how do we create a sense of urgency that's needed to address the climate emergency in a similar way that we've responded to the pandemic? Otherwise, we and others in our world won't be okay. Thank you very much for your question, Lee. Jane, I'm wondering if I can ask you to respond first around this question about urgency.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, particularly when we know that a large portion of the industry, individuals and organisations within it, struggle with the language of emergency and the timeliness associated with that. To me, I think we were talking before then about courage, and I think to me part of that is about increasing the conversation, but doing that in a really inclusive way. So Amanda spoke earlier to communities that are affected by transition. That's, coal communities come up commonly, but they're by far the only community affected. And so I think being inclusive in the way and having empathy for other people in that as part of that transition. And I would extend that even into the leaders of organisations. So I'm not suggesting we let leaders off the hook in terms of what we need them to do, but we do have to recognise that they have been put in a position where they lead organisations or systems now, and they were rewarded and placed in that position in a system that we're now saying needs to change. And that's a personally fearful position to have to be in. So I think that's my...
Can I jump in on that, Lizzie, just to follow on from Jane? I think the other thing around urgency is I think we still think we have to convince them, but I've been doing a lot of work even with CEOs of energy companies, and they, behind closed doors, are talking about the need to change, and they've got a lot of pressure on them from their insurers, from finance and investors actually moving that money. I think we saw a 75% drop in investment in new coal projects around the world within 3 years. So like they are actually seeing the writing on the wall. There's trade deals that have so I think that's something also to keep in mind, that there are actually pressures that we can talk to that actually also enables that urgency. There's actually other pressures of creating the urgency.
Chris, I'm conscious we haven't given you much space to respond. Would you like to share your thoughts on how we create a sense of urgency as well?
Sorry, unmute. You know, this is a movement we're building, and this is one of the ways that we can create a sense of urgency. Is to be visible and to come out together and support each other in asking the right questions and creating a sense, I think, of the inevitable, that we are moving towards. You know, we're following the science here. You know, it's interesting. We're talking about what does it mean to be bold. I'm starting to think that what's really bold is the people who don't want to follow the science and says we don't need to change. And they're, you know, I think they're going to be...
Chris, not the right kind of bold, I don't think.
in the minority. So I think we're, you know, there is ample evidence of the urgency here. We actually have a lot of the solutions. I think we need to just find new ways of working and collaborating to be able to move forward. But when you see your kids responding to the urgency, you know, I think you know, we definitely need to accelerate the change we're seeing across the engineering profession.
Can I just jump in on that? I think something that's come up as a theme as we've been talking about this session and with other stakeholders is this concept of, we've been doing sustainability as it stands for 30 odd years. It's been a theme, it's been around. But we haven't made a significant shift, and we're certainly not accelerating that shift in the way that we all believe that it needs to be accelerated. What I think actually the sense of urgency needs to come, we need to take a step back and actually go back to first principles on what we're trying to achieve with the designs that we're working on. And so rather than, the example I would give you on that is in a domestic housing. So rather than tweaking existing domestic housing designs to retrofit on-site energy production or insulation or whatever it might be, we need to fundamentally re-engineer, which is what we're actually really good at, and not be scared of the blank piece of paper.
So Jane, I mean, to follow your point there, it's actually asking the question of how do we want to live? You know, the advent of small family groups living in a large independent dwelling is something that's relatively modern. If we ask the question, is that actually creating the social connection and support that we need? We might, well, I don't know that we'll end up back in cooperative housing per se, or communal housing, but it might look quite different. I might use this as a segue to pick up on a couple of themes coming through around the inclusion of stakeholders or the stakeholder voice, because it's actually the presence often of the end user perhaps, or the beneficiary, or stakeholders impacted by the engineering work that seem to be excluded from the conversation and the design process when they need to be. I'm just thinking perhaps, Chris, are you interested in responding to that first in terms of, how might we better design and undertake our engineering work for benefit outcomes or benefit and outcomes through stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, well, look, we are seeing some big changes in the way that we design as engineers. There's a lot of work being done on design-led thinking, which recognises that we need to put people at the centre, the user at the centre. We need to better understand and empathise with the needs of people from that point of view, but that's still too narrow. So we need to bring in, broaden the tent and include other stakeholders that might be part of a project or a community, or the impact, even represent those stakeholders who can't represent themselves, such as those on the other side of the planet that may be, building or extracting some of the materials that we're using. And it's really exciting if you can bring all those stakeholders together, not necessarily all at once, but key stakeholders, and curate that discussion well. That's where you get the innovation. And that's one of the big upsides here, is this is about sustainability, innovation. It's about thinking in new ways of engineering, new products, new services. That creates opportunity, and it creates benefit and gets people excited and engaged. So that's where we need to shift from this idea of, we need to comply, we need to use less, we need to constrain, to no, this is about potential, and it's good for the economy, and it's good for businesses, and it's good for people involved, good for their careers. So I think we can really push on the innovation front.
Thanks, Chris. And we've had a couple of participants in today's webinar asking how do we sustain some of the change that we've just seen in the last couple of months, which I think is a really, really important question. I mean, just on a really personal level, I travel a lot for work, and suddenly I'm based in New Farm and I've been here for 4 weeks consecutively, which is quite unusual. But I'm not going to go back to the level of travel that I've had before. It's clearly highlighted there are other ways of doing work. How do we, on an individual level, retain some of these changes in practice? And then I guess at a macro level, how do we make sure we don't sort of in terms of government behaviour and big business snap back to where we were before? Robert, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like I think the snap back to the normal that we perceived as being great is a real danger. And to me, this always comes back to trying to create a vision, if you like, or an objective of what sort of world we want to actually live in, and the highest order we can get that to be, and actually start to question. It comes back to some of the other questions we were asking, you know, in terms of challenging what do we want from our world, what do we want from our lives, how does that work, and try to shift it to, you know, bounce forward rather than bounce back. So I think you know, working at that's really crucial. The time we have at the moment, and you know, my diary has freed up a bit, like other people's have, and I think it's then time to reflect on those issues around what sort of world do you want to do, how do you want to live, and what can we do to change that, and find the right language to express that to whomever we're talking with, to actually convey to them what we have in mind and how we might get there. And if we can create a compelling argument, I think then we've got a chance to shift from the way things were, which was frankly not that great, to somewhere where it's actually a lot better.
Thanks very much, Robert. I'm just looking through the Q&A feed here, and we've got a number of questions around what are our major channels for the substantive transition that we want to see in the engineering profession. And I was thinking, Jane, I might put that question to you. Where do you see some substantial opportunities for change in practice?
I think reframing, we've touched already on the reframing from outputs to outcomes. I think that would, the project I read of recently, where a water treatment plant was placed in an urban creek, the water flow regenerated the creek, and the venue was used as a wedding venue. In terms of aspirational design for me, if all our infrastructure and building projects had similarly aspirational goals, then that's a pretty significant pivot point for me. I think the other piece for me is I would like to see parts of the industry, rather than competing on a volume basis, and I'm thinking particularly in the materials space here, so rather than trying to sell more of their product, that they actually refine the way they offer value and compete because their product is the best for a certain application. And if we went to that space, then the competition becomes around how well you answer the question of strength or cladding or window covering or whatever it may be, not how many you sell. And in that way, you're using the economics to shift the system. And so I think those two for me are coming out as themes across the stakeholders we've engaged with.
Jen, I think this might be a great point actually. Do you mind talking to some of the types of organisations that the coordination team have reached out to around Engineers Declare? Because I'd like to kind of shift the conversation now into some of the really tangible ways that we're already starting to work together as a movement to change practice. So sort of taking it from the big picture down to the specifics. Just I guess in terms of the last couple of months, do you mind sharing a little bit about what you've been up to there?
Yeah, absolutely. I was picking up on the same question coming through the feed in a few places there about stakeholders and who we're engaging with. So broadly, the answer to the question is anyone who's working in this space or who is contributing to the engineering industry. So all of the organisations that individuals have named in their questions, we are either already engaged with or would love to be engaged with. And certainly, if anyone on the call today has connections that they would like to be that conduit for the movement, then please get in touch using the info account. At this stage, the conversations we're having with those types of stakeholders, that's everything from industry bodies to professional organisations to the government at state and federal level, and all of the other action groups and technical groups that contribute to this space. The conversation at this stage is really a scoping conversation about what they're doing and what we're looking to bring, and how we can make sure that what Engineers Declare and Engineers Act as a movement brings is unique and adds value in amplifying and accelerating other people's work rather than attempting to duplicate it.
And Jane, just to clarify for all the participants on the webinar today, we've essentially got two movements running in parallel now. The first was very much focused around the declaration of climate emergency and biodiversity loss. And now we're shifting into a second complementary movement focused very much around action, and the two will run in parallel. So on one hand, we've been reaching out to lots of different organisations working in this space, including professional associations, large companies and small ones. Chris, we've had a question, I think, from Paddy here about what support might be available for small to medium-sized businesses. I'm just wondering if you were happy to respond to that question.
Well, look, we have some really established, communities that are addressing some of these questions. I know working in Melbourne, it just amazes me how many organisations are actively sort of focusing on some aspect of what we're talking about here. It's not all connected up yet, and it's not necessarily moving fast enough, but there's a lot of free or low cost opportunities for people to go along and better understand from a technical point of view, from an industry networking point of view, being part of industry clusters, which is really good for small businesses and leveraging some of that other work. There's certainly grant funding. There's low interest financing for innovations. There's actually a lot of resources out there, and they're not always easy to find. So if you can connect and be part of those networks, I think we have some tremendous work that has been done. In most of our capital cities, you can tap into that.
Thanks, Chris. And one of our aspirations is to work with all or many of you who are actually on this call today to collate and share those sorts of resources. I just noticed David's asked about whether or not we're aware of implementing sustainability principles and practice, which was guidelines published by Engineers Australia. Yes, we are, and I think one of our key considerations going next is how do we help make sure that this sort of existing work is more readily available to the growing community and movement. Robert, we've had a couple of questions now regarding student engineers and what we do within the university environment, which is a really, really important opportunity. In your role as Professor of Practice with UNSW, what opportunity do you see there for us to be working with students?
Oh, look, I think there's a very good opportunity to work with students. The students are interested, there's no question of that. And I think the tertiary sector, education sector is moving too slowly to actually address some of those issues. Their problem, of course, is there's so much content that they try to put in. And regrettably, in some ways, we're failing on the technical side to actually bring people on board while we're adding in other things. So, but it needs to be embedded in the whole of all that we do. And there's probably not enough people in teaching and lecturing and educating in the university sector to be actually talking appropriately about this. I think one of the ways to actually shift that is to actually bring more people from industry in as guest lecturers, as people who are telling you what the real world is about. Because my experience with students, and I primarily work in the humanitarian space in the university, there's intense interest by the students in this sort of thing. And I know a few universities have signed up to the Engineers Declare movement, but frankly, they're still struggling with knowing what does that mean and what do we do about it. And I talk with some of the lecturers, and they're trying to get themselves up to speed so they know how to feed that into the students.
Yeah.
That can be can build upon itself, but it's got a long way to go yet.
Yes, and I think it's probably very much worth at this point noting as others have done already during the discussion, that there's substantive work that's been underway for many, many years around sustainability education, as an example. The question now is, how do we really ramp that up? And we have had a number of sustainability engineering educators join some of our Region Connect calls that we've done recently. And they raised the request, or the opportunity, that there needed to be better connection across universities between that community of people who are already working in this space. So that sounds like a really logical next step for us to invest some time and energy in. Amanda, we've sort of touched on a couple of different stakeholder groups, and I'd like to turn to government for a moment, because that's come up in a number of the questions as well. You spend a lot of your work working with and advocating for change with government. What sort of opportunity do you see there for engineers to have a stronger voice with state and federal, or perhaps local government as well, all levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is the shift of been experiencing just in the last month. I don't know if I said this in the recording or not, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I just sent emails to ministers' offices saying, hey, been doing work in regional areas, we've got some ideas around things that would stimulate the economy and would actually help us move forward on the energy transition. If you want to talk, I'm happy to write it into a report. I thought it would take a couple of weeks for them to get back to me. I got emails back within 5 minutes from some of the most conservative people in politics saying, I can't talk to you this afternoon, but can we talk tomorrow? I'm telling that story because I think we're in this period of change where things are so uncertain. Government is uncertain as well as to where to go, and they're looking for expertise to actually tell them that they can do things differently. So there is really an opportunity through joining together, through this movement, to actually have a voice, and for you to not underestimate how much gravitas and authority engineers have when they speak. There's the way to have influence that's never been there before at all levels of government. So if we go in saying, look, we can live up to these principles, we can build things differently, we can build a better world, this is how we do it. Let's put our stimulus funding into the future, not the past.
Just to pick up on that, Amanda, I completely agree. I came off the phone just prior to this call from speaking to the Victorian government, and I would complete there. So when I asked them, you know, how would you like us to contribute? How can we support you? The response was to do what the profession does naturally, which is to provide really insightful, well thought through, evidence-based thinking about the impact of proposed changes. And so I couldn't agree more that what they're looking for us to do is our jobs, but in a conceptual space to some degree. You know, if we make this change, what would that mean? And I think we certainly have a huge opportunity through the movement to ensure the profession has that voice.
So Jane, that's a great connector into the new region groups that we're just setting up, and also to action groups. So about 3 weeks ago now, we did our first round of Zoom calls with signatories to the declaration on a state-by-state basis. The idea is that we'll do that again in the next couple of weeks as well, to really start building a sense of community and opportunity for collaboration in each region. Those groups, we believe, will have primarily focus on building the movement and reaching out to local stakeholders. We also intend very shortly to set up action groups around the 12 points of the commitment. So our invitation to you is, if you've got a particular interest in point 3 or point 5, for example, around the incorporation of traditional Indigenous knowledge into design, then get involved in that group, and we'll connect you with your colleagues who are interested in focusing on that as well. So where it comes to politics and advocacy, the plan is to have an action group around elevating the voice of the profession, with politicians as a particular stakeholder group. And then we'll work together, say, right, well, maybe it's the new climate bill, for example, that we want to put a really progressive response to, or perhaps it's the Green New Deal. And I mean, I think with the movement, we have the beauty of a situation here where we can really collate the most progressive thoughts. We're not beholden to sort of old or conservative agendas. So if you're interested in that aspect of what we're talking about, brilliant. We'd love to work with you around it.
And just to build on that, I think what's really exciting is that there's, with some very targeted efforts by the right people on the right issues, we can bring about change very quickly. A lot of this will happen in a very non-linear way, which is often how we see change happening. So I think in some cases it's not about 5 years of hard slog. It's about a very focused effort to bring the right people together, work out what the path forward is, and we may find that it just opens up a very rapid change, and it will be very an exciting time.
Super, thank you very much, Chris. I'd just like to put to the panelists, I know you're all watching the questions and answers coming through as well. Are there any that really grabbed your attention that we haven't addressed yet that you'd like to respond to?
I think there's a theme coming through about sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And we picked up a little bit on it before about the specifically employers and graduates in an employment situation, but there's definitely something in here about the sphere of influence. And I think, one of my comments around courage and having courage and being brave would be to find like-minded people. And unfortunately, we're not taught networking as a skill, and it is a skill and it takes practice. But something I've learned in the last couple of years is that most people are really open to a conversation, and so reach out to people and have those conversations and find the people that can help you and support you that might be in similar circumstance or have recently been through a similar experience. And don't give up on advocating within your existing sphere of influence.
If I can build on that, I think the other thing that's really powerful that sometimes we forget to do, it's not just, it is speaking up and connecting with others, but the thing that really I think packs a punch is if you can also, when you're presenting things, be armed with examples of where companies have made brave decisions or the profession has shifted. It could be historical examples of great change, or it could be more recent ones like the companies that actually signed up to the Stop Adani agreement, or companies that have been really brave and built their business on a model of being more sustainable. And there are examples of that. So having real life examples that fit with your context and the people you're trying to influence is really powerful. You're not just doing motherhood statements, pie in the sky stuff. It's like, this is what it looks like. This is what we want.
Thanks, Amanda. And we've put an informal request out that I'll formalise now to say that we'd love signatories and your organisations to share case studies with us. The more specific and tangible we can get in terms of examples of practice change, the better. That would be, much appreciated. And I've just seen a reminder here coming through from Caroline, yes, that there are similar, very complementary movements, including Architects Declare, that have started up. In fact, it was very much the Architects Declare movement that triggered the formation of this one. So the plan will be to work closely with all of the professions that we intersect with in engineering, because the reality is we're going to achieve so much more if we work together. I'd just love to, I'm just skipping back through the questions a little bit. Someone's asked about what the shift and the change might actually look like when it happens. Can we expect something that's gradual, or might we sort of accelerate towards a point where suddenly there's a massive change? I think that's a really interesting question, and we're sort of looking into the future very much here. But Amanda, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we know yet, but I'm not going to just leave it at that. I think the interesting thing is when you look at other periods of social change in history, we often think things happened in a really short time. It's like we look at the moment where things actually shifted. But I think the key is the more people, the more critical mass we can build and have these conversations in all different sectors. So there's that critical mass of people building. And the more diversity in terms of solutions. So instead of all having one ask, actually we're all fighting for the same principles, but we're saying, hey, here's a solution that could actually help us reduce and absorb emissions. Here's a solution that actually ensures justice. The more we have that, it's the key with social change is when those things come together and spark that change really quickly. We don't necessarily get to control that, but I agree with Chris. I think COVID is a really interesting example where we had the bushfires. Now we've got this. We've actually got a lot to work with, saying, governments, you've been saying we can't act on climate change. You've just acted on this. This is great. Now you're about to pour billions of dollars into economic recovery. We want you to put it into this kind of future. We want you to build back better. We do not want the same. And I think then things can happen exponentially in a way that we can't control it. But, you know, even if it doesn't happen now, unfortunately, we're looking at more and more crises on the horizon, whether they're global financial nature or climate crises. So there's unfortunately not going to be a lack of opportunities to push and say, this is the time we want change.
The best place to predict the future is after it's occurred, of course, but I think it will change rapidly once it gets underway. And I think the point that was just being made there about COVID-19 is a really interesting one that we couldn't have foreseen, and all the rest of it. And if we use COVID in the right way, I mean, one of the dangers is everyone's focused on that. Put climate change to one side; that'll come later. Unfortunately, crises, you know, they don't line up and act in a linear fashion. You know, the bushfires, for those people affected by that, had COVID-19 on top of that. These things will actually layer on top of each other. But nevertheless, I think we can see how governments have behaved when confronted by COVID-19, and the many similarities and differences between COVID-19 and climate change. But I think we need to get ready, because I think when it will come very quickly. One of the other questions that's arising, I've seen, is the question about how do companies all address this. One of the conversations I had with one of the people who had signed up but couldn't get his company to sign up was actually looking at, from rather than a negative point of view, all the money that costs you to be sustainable, to look at the opportunities. And as people have said, there are clients out there who know. I mean, I could even refer, but I won't, you know, I'm bound by a little bit of material that I know confidentially. Those companies that walked away from Adani and how they were treated by some of their clients. And the reality is the clients know they need to change. Adani mightn't, because they have other interests. But there are opportunities for us to actually sell services, sell ideas, sell concepts to those companies, not be fearful of actually costing our clients more money by building sustainability into it.
I think to me this comes back to the concept of intention. Like, it's kind of the moonshot approach, right? Like we would never have reached the moon if we were only aiming to get between continents. So to me, you have to set the bar high, because if we continue to design to compliance and standards, which coming out of the aero industry, that's bread and butter, right? Like you design to the requirements because the requirements ensure safety. And that's true of many, many areas, many sectors within engineering. But I think for me, it's that and. So have an intentionality about the possibility, and to your point, Amanda, that comes from an awareness of what others have achieved, and be constantly looking to raise that, not so that you can be disappointed when you don't achieve that on every project. But if you don't start with that intentionality, then how can we possibly expect to get anywhere close?
Yeah.
And I think what's helpful at the moment is there's so many great frameworks that have been developed to help us think, help us deal with the complexity, because these are difficult issues, but to actually make them quite workable. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals is a great framework. Sure, it's very broad and covers a lot of different issues, but companies are adopting those and implementing them, and or a number of them, and committing to them. You know, I do some work with the Living Building Challenge, is another great framework based on regenerative design. You know, there's some of the benchmarking certification tools for projects and infrastructure. So these are some of the ways that we can you know, provoke the right questions about whether our projects and our work is intentional enough, whether it's actually achieving some of these outcomes. We don't have to start from scratch. We've actually spent decades developing some of these tools, and they're all evolving, and they're not perfect, but it actually means that we have some really robust metrics and ways of thinking about what is sustainable and what is a good outcome socially, economically, environmentally.
One of the questions that's been popping up, Lizzie, is the question about, or do we have to get political? And or do we have to get to the top table? And I think the answer to that is yes. We shouldn't just treat engineering as solving problems. It's something to hide behind that we often do. We say, oh, actually, engineering is about solving problems. You know, we solve the problems, you know, that other people give us. I think engineers have got to find the way where they get to the top table and start to set what the problems are. What are the challenges we're trying to address before we actually solve the problems. Yeah, we can solve the problems, but there's no point in solving the wrong problems. We've got to solve the right problems. So that's actually about problem setting, setting the objectives. The higher level we can get to the objectives that we're trying to create. What sort of a world we're trying to create for ourselves and our families, our communities, the better off we'll be. And engineers have got a lot to contribute, but we sell ourselves short, and we stop well short of where we should be pitching ourselves. And I think that's a reality we've got to get over. And I don't accept that engineers aren't good at communicating. I think engineers can communicate very well. We've just actually got to find our way to do it. And if you can't think to do it yourself, again, I come back to it. Reach out for someone who can help you. There'll be people you know who can actually present things well, use the right language, capture people's attention, find out how to do that, learn from them, and go for as high a level as you can. Just a comment on the moonshot. One thing about the moonshot is Kennedy didn't say you're going to send a person to the moon. He said man, I think, but anyway. He also brought them back safely. So you've got to go for a big problem, not just, we could send someone to the moon, but hey,
leave them there.
Leave them there. So set yourself a really big problem, a big challenge to go for it.
And he put a time limit on it as well. He said within 10 years. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about with the climate stuff, is we can do this now. We can do it within the time period we need to.
Which is a great link, I think, Amanda and Robert, into Sebastian's point or question about whether or not zero emissions by 2050 is a good idea, even if it's perhaps not ambitious enough. I think what we're talking about here is problem scoping and setting, as well as the target as well, and making that time bound, making that ambitious, being bold, and really pushing to mobilise as many people around that as we possibly can.
The Brits have legislated for net zero emissions 2050.
Yeah,
they've legislated for it. I mean, if they can do it, surely we can do it. We've got a lot of sun here.
We can do it. We've got to listen to the science. So we've got to halve emissions at least.
Absolutely.
By 2030, and we can actually do it more than that. And I think Beyond Zero Emissions is a really good inspirational example, where they were like, well, what if we did this within 10 years? And they've actually proven it. They've come up with reports that show how we can do it. And there are other countries that are way more ambitious than us on that. So, yeah.
I think the other thing, the point about systems change is that, and I think a challenging mindset for a lot of technically trained professionals, not just engineers, is this concept of right answer. And I spoke to that in a pre-recording a little bit, that we're trained to think that there's a right way to get there and that there's a right answer. And that's not true of these problems. And so that's quite fundamentally challenging. Like that's, there's a lot of momentum there for a different way of thinking. And so there's some questions coming up about, what do we do first? Where do we start? Who are we waiting for? We're not waiting for anyone. The solutions exist. We all need to take some action. And if we all took some action and had some intention, then the momentum of that, to your point earlier, Amanda, I think you might be surprised about what would happen.
And also, just on the political thing too, is not to lose sight of the fact that there's Engineers Declare and joining with other movements, but there are also already very powerful movements building. We have the union movement, we have the climate and environment movement, and being part of this doesn't actually stop you from being part of those groups as well, where they're much more experienced at going directly. You can actually build your own political skills by just participating in groups like Get Up that will, you know, show you how to do that stuff. And with engineers getting involved in those groups, it makes it much harder to dismiss those groups as just green lefties. It's like, no, actually we've got doctors and engineers and professionals in those groups. It's everyone as part of the climate movement now.
So to our advisory group today with us, I know we've talked previously about the importance of creating space for conversation around our values and around action and how we work together and how we build capability and the sense of urgency. I'm just wondering, you know, to listeners of today's webinar or participants in today's webinar, if you've got any sort of further and final sort of thoughts on how we might accelerate the transition that we've been discussing today. Chris, are you happy if I turn to you first?
Sorry, just in terms of...
Just broadly for participants in today's webinar who are going back to work in 15-20 minutes and thinking about their role and their points of influence. Have you got any sort of further thoughts for them around what action looks like?
Well, I think it actually starts with ourselves. You know, we've been talking about engineers like to have the answers, and I think we need to recognise that we're missing some of the key knowledge, and we've talked about some of the gaps in our education systems and the way we work. So I think it's very easy to sort of point out there and say, well, they're all doing it wrong and they need to do it another way. But often I think we need to recognise we need to develop our own more self-awareness in terms of we have grown up in an extractive, exploitative society, and we all live incredibly carbon, intensive lives, and we think a certain way about resources. So we actually need to start with ourselves. I'd recommend people get involved in some of the groups that are out there that are really trying to support and teach each other about what it means to think regeneratively, to think sustainably, to think in a way that considers the needs of society in general and other people. Read books. There's some fantastic books coming out. And I think I mentioned books specifically because we live in this world where we scan through LinkedIn and we read a few paragraphs and we figure we've got it understood. I think it's actually worth picking a few key books, and there's lots of people out there that will recommend things, and get deeply immersed in some of these topics and follow some of the thought leaders around the world. You have the great opportunity right now when geography doesn't really matter all that much, and you can participate in conferences and workshops and discussions all around the world and get a lot of knowledge from that. So look, we need to do those things in tandem. We need to obviously drive change, but let's not forget about the fact that we need to build up our own knowledge and understanding to a large degree.
Thanks very much, Kristen. Just on your point there around sharing resources, I know we'll certainly follow up after this call with all of our registered participants, and the intention is to share some book titles and podcasts and other resources there. We're also going to encourage you to join the various Slack groups that we've set up and share ideas with everyone that way as well. Jane, do you have any final thoughts and suggestions for individuals on the call today about what action can look like going forward?
I think it's something for me that I tend to practice myself, which is I would say not only to seek new information, and I completely agree with what Chris has said, but to go to the edges of that in terms of what you're comfortable with. Because again, I think this is about stretching and you might view a resource as too obscure or not directly related or too extreme in its viewpoint. But I think part of this has to be about being open to those extremities because we're trying to shift, the neutral point here, and we need to go to the extremes to be able to shift it. So I'm not suggesting we necessarily implement things from those extremes, but I think listening to them and understanding, seeking to understand where they come from is what I would say we all need to be doing.
Thanks, Jane. And I can see, Amanda, you're nodding there. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I was just thinking actually, like it might, if not really practical action that you can take right now, Sorry if this is a bit out there. I'm not an engineer, so I'm just going to say it. But after this call, take half an hour or so, sit down and write yourself your own ethics or code of conduct statement. What are the principles that you want to live by? Like, you want to actually take, I want to do everything we can to move towards net zero emissions. I want to build a more just society. What are the principles that you want to actually see in the world? And then come up with a little action plan. It could just be 3 to 5 very simple steps that you can take to move you closer to living within your values, and in your home, in your workplace, in other parts of your life. And put one thing on there that feels a bit, is stretching you, is a bit politically scary, that is actually about using the influence that you have. So it could be hosting a talk or inviting someone to do a presentation to your Rotary Club, I don't know. It could be writing a letter to your MP. It could be joining another organisation that is overtly political. But yeah, and then put in your calendar to check back in with yourself in a couple of months' time to see whether or not you've done those actions.
Sounds like a great idea, Amanda, for all of us to consider, and probably to do periodically as well. Yeah, it's not just a once-off. Robert, I'd love to give you an opportunity as well. Any sort of final thoughts on steps we take from this afternoon?
Yeah, I love what Amanda was saying, because I think that's really great advice. I guess what I'd say is simply start a conversation. And I'll give you an example. So an organisation I used to work for, got a bit agitated around the whole question of fracking and extractive industries of oil and gas. And our low carbon group wanted to have a conversation about that with the organisation. And it could have been a debate, which would have had winners and losers. But what it was about was actually a conversation, particularly a conversation with those that you don't agree with or that are coming from a different place. And I think someone touched on that in terms of at the edges of what you're comfortable with, and actually beyond the edges. And as a result of that desire by that low carbon group, there were 4 salons held to discuss and debate this. And over a couple of years, it actually significantly shifted the focus of that organisation of what it didn't do. And I'm deliberately not giving too much in the way of detail because it's still somewhat sensitive. But that shifted what they didn't do in that extractive oil and gas sector from where I would be uncomfortable with where it was to where it is a much more comfortable space. And that came from conversation, not debate, not winners and losers, conversation and listening to what people say, particularly those that don't agree with you, and continue the conversation and listen to what they're saying and work out how you actually need to respond to that. Continue the conversation. To me, action comes from conversation. So get those conversations going, armed with the thinking that Amanda has challenged you to do.
Thank you, Robert. And I'm thinking back to a question that was posted, I think by Patty maybe 15, 20 minutes ago, or no, maybe another participant, but the question was around how do we embed the value of sustainability within a business? And I think that's part of the answer. Create space for conversations. Start, Amanda, to your point on thinking about your own values, and then create space for conversation with others. And Chris, bring in resources and learning from other places, and Jane, sort of push your thinking to the edges, because we'll end up with a more creative range of opportunities as a result. Fabulous. Well, I'm conscious that there are some questions that have gone unanswered, but I think what we might do is pause this conversation for now, and through the follow-up to the event, we'll try and respond to some of the specific questions around the Engineers Declare strategy, for example, which we can certainly provide more information on. And as I said before, the intention is that this is the first of a series of events to not only discuss what's possible, but to actually get into the details of target setting and working out, who are the other stakeholders that need to be involved, which other groups can we collaborate with, like Architects Declare and Beyond Zero Emissions, and then actually get into the nitty-gritty of doing more, essentially. So in a really tangible way, we've got a couple of next steps that we'd love to leave you with. We'll just change between slides there. As I mentioned earlier, we're setting up region groups for signatories of the declaration. We'll have a series of Zoom meetings the week starting Monday, the 11th of May, which is in about 2 weeks' time. So keep an eye out for an email from us about that, and we'd love to have a conversation with you more specifically about what's going on in your state, where the opportunities for change are, and in particular, what your priorities are in terms of collaboration. Fairly soon after that, we'll launch the first series of action groups, also on Zoom, around the commitments. So in the interim, start thinking about which of the commitments perhaps resonates most for you and your organisation. And in the interim, you're welcome to use the Slack channels that we've set up to start sharing resources and connecting with people. I'm not quite sure on the logistics of how the Slack URL gets to you beyond it going out in the post-session pack, but we'll certainly work the details out there. Do use the declaration as a guide, and I'd encourage you to have a look at one of Chris's posts on LinkedIn that encourages individuals to think through a series of questions around each of the declaration commitments to prompt further thinking and actions. And I guess just pulling out two major themes from today's conversation: talk to each other, find like-minded people, reflect on your values, think about what that means in practice, and let's start really better connecting the many individuals and organisations that are already working towards a transition in this area. We're all going to need a degree of boldness and bravery because the situation is absolutely urgent. But let's use this community to create as much change as quickly as we can together. So thank you once again very much for joining us today. We're going to leave you just with a slide that shares some contact information for the coordination group. And if you're not already, we encourage you to follow us on social media. We look forward to working with you over the coming months. Thank you for your time this afternoon.